Welcome to the London Business School webinar series Beyond the Crisis, where we discuss topical issues and challenges facing companies as they gear up for making their way through the pandemic and out the other side. Today, our topic is leading through turbulent times, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who is our speaker today. Welcome, Jim. Thank you very much for joining us. Jim is an alumnus of London Business School. He's a benefactor of the school and founder and majority owner of INEOS, which is actually the UK's largest private company. In introducing and discussing these sort of challenges with Jim is another colleague, Sir Andrew Likierman. Welcome, Andrew. And Andrew needs very little introduction. Andrew is the former Dean of London Business School, and he's been a professor here for about 30 or 40 odd years. So that's all I want to say by way of introduction. By all means, tweet LBS webinars. This will be recorded and made available next week sometime as per usual. Andrew, over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much indeed. Morning, Jim. Nice to see you.
Andrew, yeah. Very nice bunch of flowers behind you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to raise the tone.
Yes, quite. I can see that.
Okay. So before we start, just for those who don't know the story, just a quick word about Jim and about INEOS. So Jim came from a very modest family background, an industrial town near Manchester. And if you want an idea of what that looked like at the time, think of the paintings of L.S. Lowry and you'll get it about there. He studied his way out of that background. He trained as a chemical engineer, as a management accountant, and we're proud to say, came to the London Business School. And meanwhile, he got experience in the chemical and textile industries and in venture capital. So the INEOS story started in 1998 and involved buying, and in most cases, turning around the chemical plants of many of the oil majors. And this culminated in a $9 billion takeover of BP's chemical operations. And at that time, that was 3 times the size of INEOS in 2005. And INEOS is now one of the world's largest chemical companies. And as you've heard from Julian, the UK's largest private company. And it's still owned by the 3 founders. It's got a turnover of $60 billion and has 170 manufacturing sites in 26 countries around the world. So, Jim, can we move on to INEOS operations first of all, in the pandemic and how you've dealt with a number of issues there. First of all, any thoughts you've got on how you've approached the pandemic? Did you set up special groups in the company, or was it, part of the role of line management to deal with the issues surrounding this?
I mean, INEOS it's got a different structure to a lot of large companies in the sense that we don't have a large head office. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't manage everything from head office because there are only about 20 of us, despite us being quite a large company. So we typically expect the boards of the various companies of INEOS to operate fairly autonomously with a bit of guidance from head office. And we have about 20 of those sort of companies or divisions. And it's relatively unusual for us to dictate. We guide, but it's not often we actually send out instructions to the businesses. We did, interestingly, in 2008, and we have to an extent, but a more limited extent, in this pandemic, sort of advised our businesses how they ought to sort of behave at the beginning, and more recently as we're emerging out of the crisis. So we did actually issue some sort of fairly basic instructions, but I mean it's sort of broadly common sense, I would say, really, in the sense that we said to people, I mean, we as you pointed out, we have 170 plants around the world. Most of those plants are making products which go into things that have been quite important in fighting this virus. I think we have 200 products which are quoted as that were quoted as essential in the American fight against the pandemic. So you know, from the protective gear to the drugs to the antibiotics, all sorts of things that we make the intermediates for those. So it was important we kept all the facilities running. So our sort of instructions were, you know, we have to keep the facilities running. We have to accept a degree of risk in doing that, but not to the extent where we think it's unsafe. But, you know, we don't live in a perfect world. So, you know, what is a degree of risk? Line management had to take that view. And we had simple rules like, clearly hygiene is very important. Social distancing is very important. We banned the use of mass transportation because that's a bit of Russian roulette. You don't know who you sat next to. And we did simple things like, you know, we have a lot of transportation coming onto the site, lots of lorries. You know, you might have 500 lorries a day on some of the sites. So we effectively quarantined things like the lorry drivers because, you know, we said that would, you know, that potentially breaches the site armor. So we issued a set of instructions like that, but we said, you know, we want the facilities operating, not shutting down. This is not an excuse for shutting down. And we reduced the headcounts on each site as far as we could. So, you know, for a site that had 100 people, it would be running at 35. All the sites run at about 35% headcount, all the offices we closed.
And in terms of the sort of, all right, so in that sense, therefore, obviously a highly decentralized operation. And so in a sense, you other than that, those general instructions, it was up to line management to decide what to do with that. In terms of the sort of the decision making and the uncertainties attached to that, you know, did you have to adjust your budgeting, the control systems for that, or was that actually more or less because the plants continued operation? Was that more or less as it was? You know, what happened with the control budgeting side?
A lot of management get confused, I find, with budgets, and they think, you know, that if they increase the budget, then the business will earn more money. It's not actually what happens, of course. So, you know, budgets are basically a reference point. It's a point against which you can pay bonuses. It's a point at which you can do a degree of planning. But, you know, at the end of the day, a budget's a budget. What actually happens is quite often very different to the budget because circumstances change, and they've changed obviously quite a lot here. Yeah. So, you know, there's no point of changing reference points, really. We know that we're probably going to, you know, we might come in at 80% or 75% of the budget or the reference point. There's no point changing the reference points. Yeah. What clearly you must do in these circumstances is watch cash very, very carefully, because that's what trips you up, not profits. And cash obviously has got other elements than just, I mean, profit, obviously sort of your, you know, where your cash is coming from, but you've got capex, you've got working capital flows, you've got interest to pay, you've got tax to pay, things like that. So what you need to do is get really focused on cash and forecasting cash, because you don't want to find yourself in an embarrassing position with banks or just, you know, either because you're coming close to breaching a covenant or you need to ask for some more money. You really don't want to go there when life's sort of getting difficult. So cash is the focus, and we're very focused on it.
I mean, so was it mainly capex that you know, sort of postponing that actually enabled you to make the adjustment?
Well, yeah, it's a combination of things, of course. I mean, yes, you if you're running a chemical business, there's sort of two types of capex. You've got capex. There's stay in business capex, which keeps your plant operationally safe, and obviously there's not much you can do with that. And then there's growth capex, so you can cut back or slow down the growth capex. But when you know, if you look at our environment where raw material prices fall, I mean, we're, you know, the chemical business, fundamentally the raw material for chemicals is oil or gas. I mean, it filters down effectively, but effectively it's oil or gas. That's where the organic molecules come from the chemical industry. So your raw materials collapse. So what happens in a crisis, that's very typical, because demand falls, so the prices of these commodity chemicals fall. So what happens then is cash comes out of your working capital. Yeah. So your profits slip, but cash, you basically liquidate some of your working capital. So there are a few things going on, you know, when you get a bit of a recession, and you just need to keep your eye on the various, you know, you've got working capital, you've got capex, you've got interest, you've got tax, and you've got the profits from your operations, and the one thing that is controllable, and you very often can do things about, which we have, is fixed costs. You know, that's in your control. So you can tell people not to spend as much money. So one of the things we've done in INEOS is we've taken all, and we're a big 60 billion, it's quite a big business. We have taken all spending authority of any level to board level. So even if you want to buy a pack of pens, someone on the board has to sign for it. So you can really slow down your fixed cost expenditure. So you can take 10, 20% off fixed costs for the short term.
The kind of example of pens, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so thinking about...
It's an old Manchester expression. If you look after the pennies, the pounds look after themselves.
I remember it well.
I know you would, yeah.
Okay, so you've commented about the sort of actions you've taken. A lot of people have said a lot of stuff is going to change after this, the way we work, the way we think about this. Is there anything particularly within an INEOS context where you think you've learned from the experience of this in terms of things you'll stick with after this is over? You know, any particular things? I'm assuming you're going to give pen authority back to the line manager.
Well, eventually. Well, I don't know. I've had mixed feelings about working from. I mean, we've obviously got half the workforce effectively working from home, and it's been remarkably effective. I have to say, the one thing that has really surprised me is that all the IT systems managed to cope with at least a tenfold increase in traffic of Skype and Zoom and teleconferencing and, you know, all that sort of stuff, because obviously we're all working remotely. But it's all worked, and it's been, I don't think we've been any less effective because people have been working from home rather than working from the office. But, you know, it is I don't think it's healthy long term for this isolated way of working. And we've recently just sent out a note saying, when it's appropriate, and that will be different in different countries, you know, people need to get back to work. But staying at home, I think ultimately probably leads to some bad habits. And I think, you know, the environment we like is in the office where you meet people, you talk to people, you have face-to-face meetings. I think bits of it will probably, you know, if you've got a long commute or something like that, then maybe you can work at home for 2 days a week or something like that, rather than coming in for 5 days. I think long distance travel is going to change a lot in the next couple of years, because people, you know, getting on an airplane is a bit of Russian roulette, isn't it? You don't know who you sat next to. And there are quite a lot of senior management are, you know, in that, or heading towards the more vulnerable category, you know, 50-year-olds. So long distance travel, I think, you know, that will become sort of, is it really, really necessary for the next year or so? I think that will change. But I think ultimately, I don't want half the workforce working from home. I don't think that's going to be healthy for anybody, and probably not healthy for INEOS in the long term.
No, very good. So people may call in and want to ask about different aspects, but can I just go on to some more general issues on INEOS? So first of all, I mean, you know, there's a cliche about, you know, never waste a good crisis. You've suggested that, you know, in management terms anyway, you've suggested, as it were, there aren't necessarily any big shifts you're anticipating as far as INEOS is concerned in working practices. Has it shown you any opportunities as well as challenges? You know, anything which has emerged from this that you felt, well, actually, you know, we've seen something we might not have seen before?
Yeah, I think, I mean, he's thrown up one opportunity for INEOS. I mean, I think the broad change, which is sort of a little bit difficult to predict what the longer term impacts are, is what's happened to oil.
Yeah.
And that is fundamentally the raw material for chemicals. Is one of the world's bigger. It's a $1 trillion industry. It's a big industry, and we use a fair proportion of the oil that's produced effectively to make plastics and all these organic molecules for drugs and pharmaceuticals, all sorts of stuff. So the fact that oil has collapsed has certain impacts on our industry, and we have to think through how long that's going. When is that going to return back to normal? The world was consuming 95 million barrels a day and is now only consuming 75 million barrels a day. So the world's gone very long and oil's collapsed. So that it affects which raw materials we use for which chemical and all that sort of stuff. But it's a bit technical, I think, for the audience to want to embark down that road. But the one opportunity that it's thrown up, which is an interesting one, is the most effective, all round anyway, effective killer bacteria and viruses is alcohol. And
that's not drinking it, I'm assuming.
It's yes, that's one of its sort of side benefits, but yeah, it does. It kills all bacteria and it kills all viruses, and it's not toxic to humans, and you can. If you get it on your hands, it's not toxic or harmful to the hand, and it evaporates off, so it doesn't leave a mess or stay there. So all these hand hygiene products, the hand gels, they're ethanol based, or there's another product called isopropyl alcohol, which is very similar. And we are the largest producer of those two products in Europe. In fact, I think we're the only producer of synthetic ethanol these days. The other ethanol comes from sort of fermentation in South America, but that's got residual products which are not very good for humans. So I think the FDA in America has banned the fermentation alcohol. So INEOS produces the alcohol, and I think the world probably will adopt a different culture of hygiene going forward. Because it clearly is one of the major defences against something like this virus. Also, just normal colds and flu, truth be known. So, I can see people carrying a little bottle of hand gel around in their pocket or the handbag, hand gels on reception desks, hand gels maybe on planes and what have you. And we've sort of got ourselves into that business because we produce about 1 million tons a year in Europe. We're the only producer in Europe, so we're sort of quite well placed to do that.
Very good. Let me just go on some other things about INEOS and activities. First of all, I know, and probably many of the audience don't, that you've had an amazingly low turnover of senior management since the creation of INEOS.
Yeah, we don't have any.
By any standards.
Yeah.
Any advice you give to those, as it were, struggling to keep their management teams together? What's been the secret, do you think, in terms of this amazing stability of management?
Well, I suppose I'll start with a stupid remark, which is, it's probably largely because they enjoy being here, and they're reasonably well remunerated. And remuneration's remuneration. But if you ask yourself the question, why do they like being here? Why do people like a particular environment, which they obviously seem to at INEOS? I think it's because your work is rewarding, which probably means you're not overly managed. And as I said at the beginning, we have this different structure. We do give people proper levels of accountability, and we try to do that at a young age. So, we give people proper jobs. We don't overmanage them. We sort of, I think, it's quite a humorous, and we like a bit of humour. I think growth helps quite a lot, Andrew, because if you're in a growth environment, it creates constant flux, doesn't it? And opportunity and changes. So, you know, there are openings where, you know, people don't get blocked in a position for a long time. There's always something happening, so an opportunity is created, and somebody maybe gets an opportunity to have a crack at something a bit more ambitious or challenging. But I mean, you know, fundamentally, it's because they're happy and well remunerated and satisfied in their work, isn't it? And it's a mixture of those. I mean, we have our INEOS triangle, which has got 4 corners, which I think describes the DNA of INEOS quite well. And I think it also applies to the sport. It's interesting, Brailsford says it applies equally well to the sports enterprises in INEOS as well. But the 4 points of the triangle, which I think describe our DNA, humour is one of them, actually, because, you know, if I don't have a laugh occasionally, I'm way past the age where I should have retired. So if I can't have a laugh occasionally, I don't want to be here. But the other 2 points of the triangle are grit and rigour. So never underestimate rigour. I mean, you taught me quite a lot about rigour at business school. You know, don't wing it, guys. You know, do your homework, do it properly. You don't know the answer, say you don't know the answer. Don't wing it. You have to be rigorous in business because, you know, otherwise you make mistakes and you do stupid things. And I've seen it so many times where people haven't been they haven't been rigorous in doing their work, and, you know, they should have been, and they wouldn't have made the mistake had they been rigorous. And grit, from the point of view, from an INEOS experience, we've made a lot of acquisitions. I have made an awful lot of money at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is when these deals always get concluded. And the other side all want to go away, go to bed and have a rest. And I don't expect the INEOS guys to feel like that. I want the other guys to surrender, put their hands in the air, say, you can have everything. Yeah, I know. I'm being a bit light-hearted about it, but you do need a bit of grit in business because it does get tough from time to time, and I don't want people wilting. And then the final one, which is the sort of strap line underneath our 3-pointed triangle, but there is a 4th line, which is good manners. Yeah. And I really do believe that's quite important in business. I like, you know, people to have good manners. You know, if you walk past people on the staircase, say good morning or say hello. Don't just ignore them or blank them. You know, some of the younger generation these days, I think they haven't quite figured out good manners sometimes. Not all of them by any means, but, you know, if in Switzerland, it's quite interesting. In Switzerland, if I stop at a zebra crossing and there's some kids crossing the zebra crossing, they all say thank you. And in the UK, some of the kids don't do that anymore. And I don't, you know, that's just not good manners on it. I don't like that. And I don't think it's good for business. So.
Very good. So there's a 5th element, really, which is about ability to stay fully functioning at 3 a.m. is also an important part of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's grit. I put that under grit, northern grit.
And I can confirm, because you allowed me very kindly to sit in on one of your management meetings, I can confirm the rigour. You don't get away with much in your management meetings if you don't know the answer. Jim, you mentioned sport, and I think a lot of people will be interested in in the sporting element here. I mean, you know, because I know you, I know you are passionate and indeed fanatical is a word I would use about sport. And so INEOS has got involved with some very, very high profile activities over the last few years. Do you want to say a bit about the background to that in terms of the, you know, other than your passion as it were, what your role, how you see this fitting into the INEOS picture?
Well, I think it's twofold, Andrew, really. I mean, the first half of it is, as you just said, you know, we have in a way, we can afford it. You know, it's a private business and it's our business. So, and we enjoy sport, all 3 of us. John, Andy and myself, we all enjoy that world of sport, and we can, so we have, but we've tried to do it well, obviously, as we do with everything, and I think we've probably done it quite well. But the other aspect of it is that, you know, INEOS is slowly moving in a more consumer-oriented direction with this car project, which is quite, you know, that's $1 billion more than $1 billion project, the Grenadier, and you've got Belstaff, there's retail. I'm sure those things, you know, there's INEOS Hygienics now, you know, you're going to see INEOS products on shelves at Boots and Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury's, all that sort of thing. You're going to see cars on the road. You're going to see people wearing Belstaff products. So, INEOS, you remember that expression a few years ago, INEOS was the biggest company you've never heard of. Do you remember? Yeah. You know, because we're bigger than Barclays Bank, and bigger than Facebook, and all that sort of stuff that people don't really know. So it's a way of communicating the INEOS brand to the consumer. But we're trying to do it well, because I think we're obviously involved in the Mercedes Formula One team quite well. And I think if you take that it's quite an interesting example. If you take that, what impact has the Mercedes Formula One team had on the Mercedes brand? It's quite an interesting question, isn't it? Because I remember Mercedes 15 years ago as being a rather old-fashioned brand, which retired gentlemen drove, because they had to be retired before they could afford it. And it was a slightly retired sort of person's car anyway, and taxi drivers. But you think of it today, it's got quite a different image, because it's much sportier. And I think of Mercedes in a very different way. And I know the chief executive of Mercedes a bit. And, I did say to him that I think it's had a big impact on the Mercedes brand, but what I think has also had a very big impact on the Mercedes brand is the fact that they've been very, very successful in Formula One. If it had been Mercedes Williams, I don't think it would have had quite the same impact as, the team that's won the championship for the last 6 years. So we're sort of going down a similar, we've got a cycling team, which is the best in the world. We've got the Formula One team. We're having a crack at, the America's Cup, and, we're having a proper go at that. And of course, we've got quite an interesting football team down in France. So we're trying to do it well, but it's, those are the two reasons we like it. We can do it, and the consumer's never heard of INEOS.
Very good.
There you go.
One last thing before we go on to the questions, which is, I'm sure a lot of people will either be thinking about starting their own business, or will certainly be interested in your thoughts about the question of any advice you'd give. I mean, having taken things from the start to where you are now, any advice or thoughts you give to people, when they start their own business, or if they're thinking about starting their own businesses?
I don't know. I think you need, whether you like it or not, if you're going to go down the entrepreneurial road, you have to have a bit of an adventurous spirit, because, you're taking risk. And if you take risks, you have to accept that you are taking risks, which means there are no guarantees of success. But the way to reduce risk is to be rigorous. And, in a sense, if you look at myself, I have been adventurous. And, we've been on the knife edge once or twice, but I've always tried to be very rigorous. And if you actually, it's quite interesting, because we send our executives, our middle executives, on courses at London Business School. And it's very successful, and they do have a series of lectures on M&A and acquisitions. INEOS has, God knows how many acquisitions we've made over the years, but many, many, and we've grown substantially by acquisition. And I think the teaching at London Business School is that 90% of acquisitions fail or disappoint in some form or another. But in INEOS, it's the other way around. More than 90% have been successful in INEOS of acquisitions. I can hardly think of one that has not been. But why is that? Because they're notoriously difficult to do well, and yet we have done well. And I think that's because we've been rigorous. I think, good manners, all that sort of thing, or, it's that bit of DNA I talked about. It's quite, you need a good relationship with the guy on the other side of the table, because if you're making an acquisition anyway, you're certainly going to go through difficult patches, and you need to sort of get through those without falling out. But
Yeah.
I don't know. There's lots of elements to being successful as an entrepreneur. So, I mean, Warren Buffett's always interesting to read. You know, he doesn't like new technology. I don't like new technology, but that doesn't mean you can't make money in new technology, because a lot of people in America have. You know, different people have different ways of doing things. You know.
I know this is a huge subject, so it's probably one I shouldn't have raised. But I mean, you know, just a couple of things that I would note before I hand over to Julian. One is, you've gone through quite a lot of setbacks on the way, one way or the other.
Yep.
I mean, you've shown you've got to be quite tough in this, you know, to get through those setbacks. You know, this is not something where you can, you know, decide at the first setback that you've got to quit. No. And also, I think the combination, if I can give a puff, as it were, to education, the fact that you've got a technical education and a financial education and a business school education, together with your, you know, highly practical approach, seems to me a pretty good combination. And so I think for me, it's often a question of getting that combination right, you know.
Yep.
I'm going to hand over to Julian now, because to see questions coming in. Thanks so much.
Yes, indeed. And thank you, Jim. Thank you, Andrew. So we've got a good 70 odd questions, and obviously we're not going to get all of them. So, and this is, I'm afraid, going to be in no particular order, because my job is to try to, you know, cluster them in as they come in. A lot of people reacting to, of course, your point about the board making decisions on paper clips or pens or whatever it was. And the question is, to what extent does giving the board this level of spending control actually kind of take away from their real job, as it were, of leading and governance, and to what extent does it actually slow down decision-making because everything goes through them? Do you want to just give us a little bit more on what's going on there?
No, I'm not suggesting that they have to process things more slowly. It just, you know, the guys lower down, they still have to put in their purchase orders and what have you, but they know it's going to get signed off by somebody on the board. So, you know, they can't be frivolous in saying that we need to buy this in the crisis. They need, because, I mean, it's common sense, Julian. What happens is one of the guys on the board gets 100 pieces of paper he has to sign every day, right, and he's probably going to look at 5 of them and sign 95 of them without looking at them. But nobody of that 100 knows whether they're going to be one of the 5 or not.
Indeed, and as you say, it just makes them think a bit more carefully. And there's another question about cash.
And just it's one of, when we acquire a business, the one thing that is in your control, I mean, if you buy a business and you make a forecast on the basis upon which you're going to finance it and the basis upon which you're going to justify the price and what have you, one of the things that's in your control is whether you can do anything with the fixed costs. So when we bought BP Chemicals back in 2005, the fixed costs were about 1.8 billion. And we made the presumption we could save 25% of the fixed costs. But that is in your control. Yeah. If your forecast is based on, I think the cycle's going to get better and the margins are going to go up, or a competitor is looking a bit weak and he's going to fall over and therefore we're going to sell more volume. Right. They're things that are not in your control, whereas fixed costs are in your control. And if you simply take away signing it, you know, we've had businesses where we've taken away the credit cards of people in the business and we've taken away 600 credit cards. So you've got 600 people spending company money on a credit card, which sort of feels like, oh, well, you know, I need a new chair, I need a new desk, I need a new lamp. Well, you know, so you can do something about it.
Good. Couple more questions about cash. Did you do anything differently in terms of getting cash from customers or payments to suppliers in the first couple of months of the crisis?
No, we didn't do that. No, well, I mean, the only thing we found, one or two of our customers, they slipped a bit because we're very good on customer collections. We do say to our customers, we're not a bank, so we're happy to provide you with a product on time, really good quality, but you need to pay us on time. And we're reasonably strict about that. But obviously, people get a bit stressed in a crisis. So.
No, exactly. So someone says, how many months of cash is sufficient buffer? I mean, that's like saying how long is a piece of string. I accept it. But perhaps the way to ask the question is along the lines of of how much planning did you do in general? I don't mean specifically around the crisis, to ensure your resilience. I mean, give us a sort of a window into the way that you do the necessary levels of risk analysis at a board level as you look at a whole range of possible scenarios about things that could go wrong.
I mean, one of the problems you have, even now, it's quite difficult to predict how severe the recession is going to be in depth and in time. So even now, that's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to judge, isn't it? Because you think about, America's got, 35 million people signed up for unemployment. I don't know how many the UK's got. Is it 8 or 9 million in the UK?
Less.
You've only got 5 million people working in the UK. You've got 10 million civil servants and 10 million people on the dole. How long and how deep is this recession going to be? It's quite. I'm finding that a bit difficult to predict at the moment. So actually predicting how our business is going to look, and therefore what those financial constraints are, is quite. I mean, the one thing we can do is track cash really closely and the order book. What you don't want ever to do if you're running a business is trip a covenant, but most of our lending is covenant free. So I can give you an example of what did trip us up in 2008, which came out of the blue. Was we had banking arrangements in 2008 where we did trip up a covenant and caused us a lot of grief. And that was simply because the price of oil crashed from $140 to $40 in a 6-month period. Yeah. In other words, the price of oil went down by $100. Yeah. And in our 2 refineries, we have 10 million barrels of oil sat in the refineries, keeping them wet. Yeah. So that 10 million barrels always sits in the refineries, like the metal that the refinery is made of is always there. But because that's classed as stock, the value of stock reduced by 10 million times 100, which is 1 billion, if you've got the maths. Mm-hmm. But there's no cash impact of that because you've still got 10 million barrels of oil floating around in the refinery. Yeah. And about 3 years later, it was back up over $110. Yeah. And that tripped covenant because we had to write off $1 billion to the profit and loss account because that's how accounting works in the UK. And that tipped up the covenant and that causes all sorts of grief. So, that was a lesson learned. So we don't have those types of covenants in our banking arrangements anymore. So it's, for us, it's a question of being very focused on cash and try, there are levers we can pull in our business. We know what the levers are. And there's a sequence of levers. So you don't want to pull them all in a panic. You want to pull them as you see that you need to. So.
Got it. Okay, I mean, it links to another question, which was about what sort of costs are you continuing to, or what sort of investments is a better way of saying it, are you continuing to make through the crisis? You did talk about the 2 different types of CapEx, but we had an earlier webinar in this series where the evidence was that on average, companies that continue to invest in their R&D, continue to invest in their corporate social responsibility type things, actually, because those are long-term investments, did better than the ones who kind of put the brakes on them. Is that something you recognize? I mean, other areas where you're continuing to invest, even though there's obviously no kind of direct return on those investments?
No, all we've done is delay some projects to reduce the capex bill. I mean, basically at the moment, but it's a series of levers. I mean, if you've got a project which you're in the middle of, if it's more if it's more expensive to delay it and then finish it than it is just to continue,
yeah, indeed,
then that's a lever you don't want to pull until you have to, but you can do. Yeah. See what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just a judgment.
And there's a link question. What are the top 3, I mean, you don't have to give me 3, obviously, initiatives that are being taken to keep INEOS innovative? And I guess this probably extends way beyond the crisis. I mean, Apart from, you've already talked about some of the specific projects, new business areas you're investing in. Anything else to add there?
Only deals, there are, we're looking at one or two things which have cropped up because of the crisis. One or two people say, no, well, I might sell that, so that's another opportunity.
So there was a question about, there was a question about your business model of, as you say, deal making, and obviously being, making use of lending. I mean, I guess the answer to this is, your model going to change through the crisis? No, you've already said that essentially that the crisis is creating opportunities for things to buy. And
also I've always said in M&A that, don't try and, simply buy things on the cheap. We're quite happy to pay a fair price. Yeah. We won't pay a silly price, but if you're of the mind, you just want to buy things on the cheap when people are on the knees, then it's not, you have to be careful. If you just want to buy cheap things, you just buy rubbish. We only want to buy decent things.
If you can just tell us what Grenadier is. You hopped over that, and a lot of people won't be heard of Grenadier.
The Grenadier is, it came about when Jaguar Land Rover announced the demise of the Defender about 3 years ago, and it really left a bit of a hole in the marketplace because there isn't the equivalent vehicle out there. So we invested in this thing called the Grenadier. It's being engineered in Germany and Austria by the same sorts of people who engineered the G-Wagon. It'll be a four-wheel drive, off-road, BMW powered, a little bit like, sort of cross between a G-Wagon and a Defender, I suppose. It'll be built in Europe. But it will have the, I suppose it'll be very good off-road. It'll have German reliability, be a sensible price, and it'll look quite good, I think. So I think it'll be quite a successful vehicle, and a pickup truck to go with it.
So there's a question from one of my former students, actually. I recognize the name, and he says, look, at LBS we teach that acquisitions on average disappoint, but we also teach that unrelated diversification usually fails as well. So
there you go.
How do you want to respond to that?
I don't know. I don't know, but well, we'll see, won't we? Time will tell. I think generally speaking, those two things are correct, but they're not always correct.
Right. Yeah. Fine.
We like challenges,
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have shareholders to worry about, which is another nice aspect of it. So, your four.
Well, we do have shareholders actually, but.
Okay, but the point is, who they all are, right?
Yeah. Trust me, I wouldn't be investing in the Grenadier if I don't think it's going to be. I think it's going to be extremely successful, right. Frankly. But we'll see.
So the four corners of the triangle: humor, grit, rigor, good manners. I hadn't heard that before, and I do salute you for having an original set of values or principles. Yeah. Because most people come up with integrity and honesty and openness and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Where did these come from? And don't you get pressure to kind of add some additional ones in, which are a little bit more sort of?
Oh no! If you look, we have what we call the INEOS Charter, or the Compass, INEOS Compass, and it's basically a series of words, and they do include things like integrity and honesty and stuff. But those are my key words for INEOS DNA. And that's what I think most succinctly.
And when did you come up with those? Or do you remember, was it around the kitchen table or something like that?
I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years ago, something. Yeah.
But the point is that this is a way of actually trying to sharpen up a point of view on who you are, which presumably attracts certain people and obviously doesn't attract others, and that's a good way of.
Well, yeah, and we do like a certain, when we acquire businesses, some people enjoy the INEOS environment, and some people like to have a big head office, giving sort of not feather bedding, but they like a bit of cotton wool, a bit of help here, and some of the people like the freedom of being more autonomous. It's just there are different types of personalities, aren't there? And that latter type of personality works quite well in INEOS. I mean, I think another company was quite interesting. They have very clear definition of the type of people they like. A Red Bull. Red Bull are very clear, and for their sports people as well as their business people. Interestingly, somebody said that to me quite recently. But INEOS is the same, sports, and those words apply equally to Chris Froome or Geraint Thomas or Egan Bernal, don't they? Grit, rigor, grit is an obvious one. Rigor, you've done all your training. You need a sense of humour because, at certain times it's bloody miserable when you're doing training in the rain and freezing cold on a Monday morning and you don't want to get out of bed, And good manners is always a good thing, I think, in the...
Good. Well, we're jumping around, but I'm going to pick up on something you just said about sports. So, so obviously, you love sport. That's one reason to get into it. I can see some commonalities in the values. Are there things you've learned from investing in these sports teams and the David Brailsfords of this world or whatever that you then taken back to INEOS? Can you share us some almost like the management lessons from sports?
I think what it's more of an observation. I've observed that it requires the same sort of rigor to be successful in sport as it does in business. It's not so different. The fact that Dave Brailsford has been so successful, winning the Tour de France, which we'd never won 8 years ago, that Brits had never won it. It's not an accident. He is exceedingly rigorous. And the same for Ben Ainsley with his sailing. It's, the same with Toto and his Mercedes Formula One team. That, there's a lot of rigor. It's not an accident that they've been very successful.
Question on social responsibility, if you like. Great discussion. How will you implement your circular economy and sustainability agenda at INEOS? Can you speak about that set of issues, I guess, more in general? I mean, there's huge environmental challenges. Before the crisis, that's the only thing people wanted to talk about was sustainability.
It's quite a difficult one to talk about, isn't it? I mean, before the crisis, the hot topic of the day was single-use plastics.
Right.
And you can understand the concerns there, but that has all disappeared in the last 3 months and nobody's cared one little bit about single-use plastics because single-use plastics have been so critical in fighting the virus, haven't they? The throwaway gowns, the throwaway rubber gloves, the throwaway masks, the throwaway hypodermics, And I think it's a complicated subject. The biggest issue, if you think of plastics in the sea, the biggest issue there isn't plastic, it's human behavior. If you don't throw it in the sea, then plastic isn't an issue in the sea, because plastics are actually a very good material and they're very good at what they do. In terms of doing all we can to reduce carbon footprints and all that sort of thing, those are extremely good pressures for us to, receive. There's nothing wrong with that. But even that has a complication. There's no point killing people in Europe with carbon taxes for all that to do shut, what is really excellent manufacturing down in Europe because of the cost of the carbon tax, and just create the same industry out in Indonesia or Thailand where they just chuck it all up to atmosphere. That's achieving absolutely nothing. So people, it's good to put the pressure on, but it has to be thoughtful, Julian, really, And if you look at INEOS all the time, our footprint is improved. Another issue, but we're looking at building a huge new facility, 5 billion new petrochemicals facility in Antwerp. We're meeting with all sorts of resistance. It's a new cracker, and it doesn't matter. It's a petrochemical complex, and what that is renewal of old technology. So what will happen is we'll build a fabulous new facility which has got an infinitely better carbon footprint than all the old technology from 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, which is prevalent in Europe. In America, all the new stuff's coming in all the time. In Europe, it hasn't, because there are all these, green pressures and things like that. So it's a bit like, if you look at an old car, it's twice as polluting as a new car. So why do you stop people building a new car and replacing an old car with a new car? But can you see what I mean? It's more complicated than it looks. And sometimes you finish up with stupidity.
That's right. No, indeed, we have to keep the world economy moving forward whilst we plan for the fully sustainable future. I mean, we can't just stop things. So we're running out of time. I'm going to ask a few more questions, but Andrew, if you've got anything you'd like to chip in a second, please do so. Before I can turn to Andrew, here's one more for you, Jim. You touched on working from home. A lot of people working from home. Some people have got into bad habits. Of course, people want to know what bad habits you have in mind. Is this, go on.
Well, you just don't, one of the things I said right at the beginning was that anybody working at home has to be telephoned once a day. But I think it's just, 10 o'clock in the morning, or maybe I'll go down and, do a bit of gardening, or, maybe go for a short bicycle ride, or, you don't have those same constraints that you do. I'll make a couple of phone calls. Right. You haven't, people sort of wander a bit maybe after a while. I mean, a friend of mine who does run a small business and all her people are working from home, she makes them fill an hourly timesheet in. They're working from home, they fill an hourly timesheet in. And everybody can see everybody else's hourly timesheet. But ultimately, you need, we all know that we respond to a bit of pressure, don't we? Yeah, we do. Otherwise, maybe I'll go off and bake a fruitcake.
Exactly. And the thing is, it doesn't take very many shirkers for the whole sort of atmosphere to be damaged, if you see what I mean. Because we don't mind working long hours as long as we think everybody else is. But
no, correct. Yeah.
The sense that some people are coming out taking us for a ride is what.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Right. So. And Andrew, any quick thoughts on any of the above? You must have heard some things that you either want to share some of your experiences or some additional follow-up questions to Jim.
No, I think, look, I've just one observation. INEOS is, in a sense, a pretty extraordinary animal. Here we are, a very large company, still private, run by its 3 founders. This is quite a difficult trick to pull off. And that's why I asked Jim about this ridiculous question about, so what advice would you give, in general, to anybody starting a business? But I do think there's actually some interesting lessons to be learned from INEOS in terms of the way things have gone. And I think anybody who's starting a new business can actually, looking at the way INEOS has gone over those, can actually learn things. I mean, I think there's, it's a good story, actually. Difficulties, and it's not all been, one smooth upward projection. No. So, I think it's also about this business about, coping with adversity that I think has been, a very important part of the story. Anyway, just an observation. I have nothing else to add.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to finish, Jim, with 2 questions, a little bit more personal. First, when did you figure out it was time to go it alone? Some 30 odd years ago, 40, you tell me. And secondly, can you imagine ever retiring? So both ends of the spectrum, if you want to take one or both of those, and then we'll close.
Well, quickly, I think probably 35. When I was 35, I moved out of industry into venture capital or private equity. And one of the reasons, apart from the fact I got paid 3 times as much and I got a fancy car,
always helps.
Played a part in my reasoning, I have to say. But one of the reasons was that I thought it might present an opportunity at some stage for me to have a go at something. And being in industry, it was highly unlikely to happen. So it was obviously a bit in my DNA in my 30s. So that's the answer to the first question. And the second question about retiring is, no, I don't think I would ever. I can't imagine. I have to say, it's quite interesting. I've never worked harder than I have in the crisis. I've had to cancel all the holidays, and I start early in the morning, and it's just one conference call after another. I've never worked hard. You're not doing any traveling. All you do is work. So I have worked very hard, but no, I don't. I enjoy it, you see. So, and I keep a balanced life. I enjoy the fun things in life. I still, do my exercise and cycling and all that sort of stuff. I like holidays and visiting and, new places and adventures from time to time. We did the Northwest Passage in the summer, which I think we were the only boat to cross from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So a few things like that. But so I tried to keep it balanced. But if I wasn't working, I'd be a nightmare.
Well, I know a few people like that, probably myself. And we've always got Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger to look up to as people who
yeah, they're still going. 90s. They're both in their 90s. Yeah,
90s,
they're fantastic. Yeah, I like those two characters actually. I think they're very good. Yeah.
Have you've met them, I guess?
No, but I read his notes sometimes. So I think he's very funny. Yeah.
Well, exactly, absolutely. So there's exactly. And retirement is overrated. I think we can all agree on that. So we are going to finish now. So thank you so much, Jim. Fascinating insight into the company. Thank you, Andrew. Sada, if we could get that final slide up just to give everybody a little bit of a flavour for what's going to happen next in this series. On Thursday, we have a discussion of how to make your operation resilient to future shocks. We've been talking about resilience in all its forms. This is really about the internal operations of a company. And we have three people. We have Alex Yang, who's a colleague in the management science area at LBS. We have Michael Davis, who's a guest lecturer. And then also we have Otti Vogt, who is a senior executive at ING Group. So please join us on Thursday to discuss this important issue. I'm also going to give you a little bit of forewarning. There's loads of webinars coming next week through our reunion event. Those of you who are alumni will be particularly interested in that. I'll provide more details about all of those things on Thursday. So without further ado, thank you, audience, for listening. Hope you enjoyed today's session, and we'll leave it there. Thanks. Bye-bye.